Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to this presentation. My name is MJames, and I'm an associate professor of applied linguistics at Arizona State University. And today I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes about one of the recent studies that I've carried out, and I'm looking forward to hearing afterwards any questions that you might have. I'm going to stick pretty close to a set of notes that I have here so I keep on track and make sure the presentation doesn't go too long. So first of all, let's take a look at some background information. We'll get right to this. The topic of the study is transfer motivation. More specifically, how ESOL teaching might influence students' motivation to transfer learning from the ESOL classroom to other situations outside that classroom. So let me start by providing a bit of background information on this topic. First, this study rests on the idea that a fundamental goal of ESOL education is students' transfer of learning to new situations. For example, in an English for academic purposes or EAP context, in a course on EAP, there's an expectation that students will transfer what they learn in the EAP course to their academic work in other courses. And if students don't transfer learning from the EAP course to their other courses, then the value of the EAP course is questionable. The importance of transfer is especially obvious when English or any other language is being taught for a specific purpose, like in an English for academic purposes context. But ultimately, transfer is a fundamental goal in any ESOL or second language education context. Now, one thing that's important to know about learning transfer is that it can happen in two main ways. First, transfer can happen automatically when one situation resembles another situation. For example, I learned to drive a car a long time ago, and I drive all the time, so I think I'm pretty good at driving cars, but I've never driven a truck. So if I get behind the wheel of a truck for the first time, what happens? Well, my ability to drive a car will transfer to this new situation because of all of the similarities, like the truck has a steering wheel just like the car. The truck has a gas pedal and a brake pedal just like the car. There are left and right turn indicators and so on. So I won't have to think about this because the transfer will happen automatically. On the other hand, the second main way that transfer can happen is deliberately, and this doesn't depend on resemblances between situations. For example, when I'm driving that truck and trying to navigate through a traffic jam, I might deliberately reflect on a video that I recently watched about how atoms and molecules move through space and they avoid smashing into each other. And I try to do the same thing as I'm driving the truck through the traffic. There's no resemblance between those situations, driving the truck and me watching the video on atoms and molecules. But I'm able to transfer learning between these situations deliberately. So while both types of transfer, automatic and deliberate, are important, I'm going to focus today on deliberate transfer, the second type of transfer that I just described. This is a worthwhile focus because deliberate transfer can occur over relatively large distances because it doesn't rely on situations resembling each other. And that's valuable because in ESOL education, we don't always know what kinds of future situations our students are going to find themselves in when they leave our class. Maybe those future situations are going to resemble situations in our class, but it's also likely that our students are going to find themselves in diverse future situations that have less resemblance to our class. So preparing ESOL students to transfer learning deliberately is worthwhile. Now, since this kind of transfer is deliberate, it requires motivation. Without motivation, I won't make the effort to look for connections between situations and try to find ways to apply something that I've learned previously. In other words, if I'm not motivated to transfer learning, deliberate transfer is unlikely. With that in mind, if ESOL teaching aims to meet this fundamental goal of promoting students' learning transfer, it makes sense that ESOL teaching should aim to promote students' motivation to transfer learning. And here's where there's a gap that I'm trying to fill with the study that I'm describing today. There has been research on learning transfer in ESOL education, but there has been almost none that has looked at students' motivation to transfer learning. I did a study about 10 years ago that looked at whether students in an EAP context were motivated to transfer learning. And that seems to be the only study that has looked directly at this topic. In that study, the findings showed that students weren't as motivated to transfer learning as might have been expected, given that because it was an EAP context, there were immediate needs for the students to transfer their learning. They were taking other courses at the same time that they were taking the EAP course. So there were immediate needs, immediate opportunities for them to transfer learning. But motivation, there were some gaps. So those findings were interesting, and to follow up on that, it's worth looking more closely at the relationship teaching might have with students' motivation to transfer learning. So that's the general background of the study that I'm going to describe today. And with that in mind, let's take a look at the study more closely. So with that background in mind, I developed a study to answer the following 3 research questions. In an ESOL education context, are students motivated to transfer learning? 2, is teaching consistent with teaching for transfer? And 3, is there a relationship between teaching for transfer and students' transfer motivation? To answer this question, I carried out a questionnaire survey study in fall 2020 with students in first year 3-credit EAP courses at a U.S. university. These are courses that undergraduates are required to take as part of their degree programs, and they have 3 hours of classes per week for a 15-week semester. All students at the university have to take first-year writing courses, and these EAP courses are sheltered versions of those first-year composition courses. So they're specifically for students with ESOL-related needs. The main goals of these EAP courses include the development of students' academic English writing abilities, and the students are assessed through their production of 3 or 4 multi-draft writing assignments. Each assignment involves writing several pages, for example, to explain a concept, to argue a position, to propose a solution to a problem. And they involve using various writing strategies such as defining, classifying, and comparing/contrasting. So this seemed a particularly suitable context for examining transfer motivation because besides their EAP courses, these students were also taking other academic courses in various disciplines. And this meant that the students were likely to have immediate opportunities to transfer learning from the EAP course. In other words, learning transfer seemed particularly relevant in this second language education context. Therefore, it seemed like a particularly suitable context for this study. I chose this particular university also for practical reasons because I had contacts there who could help me to arrange data collection. As for numbers, you can see here that 287 students participated. The study actually started off with a much bigger number because a total of 351 students completed the questionnaire. But before doing any kind of analysis, I screened the data, which meant removing any students who had left large numbers of questionnaire items blank or who had filled out the questionnaire carelessly, for example, by just choosing the same answer for every item. So after that screening, I was left with 287 participants. On this slide, we get a closer look at these 287 participants in terms of background information. You can see here that it was a diverse group in a variety of ways, and I'll leave that slide there for a few seconds, or you can pause it so you can browse over this information. So those were the participants, and now let's take a closer look at the data that I gathered. In fall 2020, around the middle of the semester, I emailed the instructors of all sections of the EAP course to ask if they would be able to forward my invitation email to their students. The invitation email included a link to the questionnaire, which was online, and it took about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. The main part of the questionnaire had 44 multiple choice items, each of which was a statement followed by a 5-point Likert scale, with the 5 choices being strongly agree, agree, not sure, disagree, and strongly disagree. This was a new questionnaire that I had created, so I had to take steps to make sure that it was of sufficient quality. We'll take a look in a minute at some of the specific items on the questionnaire, but first let me say a few things about how I developed it. I spent several months developing and piloting the questionnaire to begin with, and this involved reviewing research on transfer motivation and teaching for transfer, and coming up with drafts of questionnaire items. And I tried out drafts of the questionnaire with classes of graduate students I was teaching. They were taking research methods courses with me, as well as trying out the questionnaire with classes of undergraduate students in EAP courses. As a result of this piloting, the questionnaire went through multiple rounds of revisions, for example, removing or changing items that were confusing, until the questionnaire emerged in the form that I'm describing here today. And then after the 287 students had completed the questionnaire, I was able to do some statistical tests to examine the questionnaires quality in greater detail. First, it's widely recommended that with a new questionnaire like this, we do a statistical test to see if the questionnaire is measuring what we think it's measuring. In other words, to check the questionnaires validity. The way that that works is if we think the questionnaire is measuring one construct like motivation, or maybe 2 constructs like motivation and anxiety, or 3 constructs like motivation and anxiety and learning, and so on, we use a statistical test to see how many constructs the questionnaire is actually measuring. The statistical test examines the relationships between all of the items on the questionnaire to see how they cluster together, because that clustering will show how many constructs the questionnaire is actually measuring. One way of doing this is called a principal component analysis using statistical software SPSS. So I did that, and the results showed me that the questionnaire was measuring 9 constructs, which I'm going to show now. So you can see the 9 constructs on this slide. For the first one, and these are in categories. The first category, I've put 2 of the constructs together under the general category label of motivation to transfer. And the first of the constructs there is transfer motivation. For this construct, there were 8 items, and you can see an example here. One of the items said, in my courses in the next few semesters, I will make an effort to use knowledge and skills from this semester's EAP course. And again, the students had to choose strongly agree to strongly disagree in response to this item. So this particular item is focusing on students' intention to transfer learning. And besides intention, other items for this construct, the first construct, transfer motivation, focused on students' effort to transfer learning, students' attitude about transferring learning, for example, if they think it's enjoyable, and students' desire to transfer learning, for example, if it's something they want to do. The focus of those items on intention, effort, attitude, and desire came from my reading of research on transfer motivation. The second construct is negative motivation to transfer, or negative transfer motivation. An example here is an item which said, in my courses in the next few semesters, I will not try to use knowledge and skills from this semester's EAP course. Now, this construct was a bit of a problem because I realized that it included all of the negatively worded items on the questionnaire that were related to transfer motivation. It seemed strange to me that this would form its own construct, separate from the first construct, transfer motivation. And when I read into this, I learned that in questionnaire research, negatively worded items often cluster together. Because one of the goals of checking the validity of a questionnaire is to find the simplest combination of constructs possible, I ultimately decided to exclude this construct from the analysis that I did later. This is something that I'll explore in follow-ups to this project, but since I decided to exclude it from further analyses for this project, I'll just cross it out here, and we'll pay that construct no more attention. Next is the teaching for transfer constructs, the next category of constructs on this slide. There are 5 of them, and I'll go over them one by one. The first of these is creating contextual similarities. In other words, making the EAP learning context resemble transfer contexts. That's important because it helps students to see connections between the EAP classroom and other contexts, and that helps with transfer. And an example of this construct is an item which says, this semester's EAP course materials, for example, the textbook, are similar to materials in other courses. Next is teaching general principles. And this construct is important because if teaching focuses only on superficial facts and routine procedures, it can be more difficult for students to see connections to other contexts, especially if those contexts are different from the EAP classroom. For this construct, an example item says, this semester's EAP course materials, for example, the textbook, taught general principles of writing. The next 2 constructs are about providing ample practice for students in reading and writing. Providing ample practice is important because with practice, students' abilities can become more automatic, and this can help with transfer, especially to contexts that resemble the EAP classroom. An example for reading is this item, which says, in this semester's EAP course, we looked at many examples of writing. And an example for providing ample writing practice is this item, which says, in this semester's EAP course, I had to write a lot for homework. The last of the teaching for transfer constructs is providing variable practice for students. This means making sure that the practice that students get is not always the same, not too repetitive. For example, if students are always writing the same kind of essay on the same kind of topic, for example, that's not as helpful as writing different kinds of genres on different kinds of topics. That kind of variability can help students to notice the underlying patterns in what they're doing. And when students can notice those patterns, it should be easier to transfer to new situations, especially if the new situations are different from the EAP classroom. An example for this construct is the item on the screen here. In this semester's EAP course, the writing assignments all had a similar topic. And the final category here at the bottom of the screen is constructs that are influences on transfer motivation. And there are just 2 constructs here. The first of these is perceived competence. For example, one of these items said, in this semester's EAP course, my writing became better. The idea with this construct is that if students perceive that they have built their competence at using their English abilities, they're more likely to be motivated to transfer learning. And next, and this is the final construct in the entire list, this is expectations for and beliefs about transfer. And you can see an example here. If I use knowledge and skills from this semester's EAP course in other courses, I will get higher grades in those courses. That particular item is focusing on students' expectations that transfer will have a positive impact. Besides expectations about impact, other items for this construct focused on students' expectations about whether they will have opportunities to transfer learning, and students' beliefs about whether transfer requires making an effort rather than just happening automatically. The focus of these items on expectations and beliefs came from my reading of other research on transfer motivation. So this is what the principal components analysis showed that the questionnaire was focusing on, these constructs. There's one other thing that I did to check the quality of the questionnaire. Besides checking the validity through the principal components analysis, I checked the reliability, which we can see on this slide here. And the analysis that I did, again using SPSS to do a reliability analysis, showed that for all 8 of the remaining constructs, after I removed the negative transfer motivation construct, for all 8 constructs, the scores, which were Cronbach's alpha scores, were all above the recommended minimum level, which I took as an indicator, again, of the sufficient quality of the questionnaire. So that's the questionnaire, and the 287 participants filled that out over about 2 weeks near the end of the fall 2020 semester. When they were finished, I analyzed the data to come up with answers to the research questions. So let's take a look at those now. The first research question asked if these students were motivated to transfer learning. This slide shows the descriptive data that I used to answer this question. The numbers you see here are the totals across all of the questionnaire items that focused on transfer motivation. So the number in the column on the right, for example, means that 38.55% of all of the responses across all of the items that measured transfer motivation were strongly agree. And in the next column to the left, we can see that 47.73% of all of the responses across all of the items that measured transfer motivation were agree. If we add up the numbers in the 2 columns on the right side of the table, we can see that over 85% of participants responded positively, choosing either agree or strongly agree for the questionnaires transfer motivation items. So it's reasonable to conclude that for this group of students, in this EAP context, it was common to be motivated to transfer learning. On this next slide, here's the second research question. Do these courses reflect teaching for transfer? This table shows students' responses to the questionnaire items that dealt with teaching for transfer. For example, the top row is for the teaching transfer technique, creating contextual similarities. So the number in the column on the right, for example, means that 6.56% of all the responses across the creating contextual similarities items were strongly agree. Now, if we look at just the right side of this table, we can see how many responses were positive by adding together the numbers for the strongly agree and agree columns. For creating contextual similarities, if we add those 2 columns together, we can see that about 28% of the responses were positive. For teaching general principles, about 88% were positive. For providing ample reading practice, about 88% were positive. For providing ample writing practice, about 75% were positive. And for providing variable practice, about 44% were positive. So it appears that it is common for these courses to teach general principles and to provide ample reading and writing practice, but it's less common for these courses to provide variable practice and, in particular, to create contextual similarity. And on this slide is the third and final research question. Does teaching for transfer influence these students' motivation to transfer learning? To answer this question, I did a standard multiple regression analysis, which is a common statistical procedure for examining relationships between variables. For this procedure, I treated transfer motivation as the dependent variable, and I treated all of the other constructs as independent variables. I ran the analysis, and I checked to make sure all the assumptions of a regression analysis were met, which they were, and that led to these results. First, as you can see here, the results showed that the independent variables statistically significantly predicted transfer motivation, and the effect size is large. But digging deeper, we can look at the contribution of each of the constructs, and we can see here that while all of the constructs have a positive or negative impact on transfer motivation, Only the two at the bottom of the table have impacts that are statistically significant. Those are indicated by the asterisks in the bottom two rows of this table. In other words, the impacts of the teaching for transfer constructs, which were, again, creating contextual similarity, teaching general principles, providing ample reading practice, providing ample writing practice, and providing variable practice, these were not statistically significant. But the impacts of the other variables, which were the two at the bottom of the table, perceived competence and beliefs and expectations, these were statistically significant. And just in case anybody is interested in more details about the results of the multiple regression analysis, here's the final predictive model. So in terms of an answer to that third research question, we can conclude this. Teaching for transfer had very little influence on these students' transfer motivation. Of the teaching for transfer constructs, creating contextual similarity came the closest to having a statistically significant impact on transfer motivation. In contrast, the other constructs, perceived competence and, in particular, transfer expectations and beliefs, did have statistically significant influences on transfer motivation. So that brings us to a discussion of the findings, focusing on implications for teaching and for future research. The first point here is in relation to the answer to the first research question. The findings showed that transfer motivation was common in this group of students. This is positive in that teachers in this ESOL context seem to have little to worry about regarding students' transfer motivation. But this study was done at only one point in time and in only this one ESOL context. So it's uncertain if these findings will be the same with future groups of students in this context or with students in other ESOL contexts. With that in mind, it may be worthwhile for teachers in this and other ESOL contexts to monitor students' transfer motivation using a questionnaire like the one used in this study. It would be simple to use and it would generate valuable information. The second main point here is in relation to the answer to the second research question. The findings showed that some teaching for transfer techniques, more specifically teaching general principles and providing ample practice, these were commonly reflected in these courses. But other techniques, more specifically providing variable practice and creating contextual similarities, were much less common here. This is positive in that the teaching that is happening in this ESOL context could be helping to promote students' learning transfer, but there are more ways in which this could be done. So if teachers in this program were to investigate and find out that there is less learning transfer happening than what they would like to see, the findings here point to steps that they could take to try to address this problem. They could do more to provide variable practice, and they could do more to try to create contextual similarities. And those teaching techniques might help with more learning transfer. The third and final main point on this slide is in relation to the answer to the third research question. The findings showed that the students' transfer motivation was significantly influenced by their expectations and beliefs and by their perceptions of competence, but not by teaching for transfer techniques. Now, this is very interesting. Transfer over far distances is deliberate, so motivation must play an important role. But it looks like teaching for transfer may not help with that. In an ESOL context like this one, where transfer motivation is common, this may not be a concern. But in ESOL contexts where transfer motivation is less common, teachers may want to find ways to help students to develop transfer motivation. The findings for the third research question do also point in some useful directions here, because these students' transfer motivation was strongly influenced by the students' perceptions of competence and, in particular, their expectations for and beliefs about transfer. So teachers who want to help students to develop transfer motivation may want to look for ways to help students to perceive themselves as competent and to develop transfer-conducive expectations and beliefs. In other words, it may be a good idea to expand the idea of teaching for transfer in these directions. So that's all I have to say about this research project, which I found very interesting, and I hope that that information was useful for you as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. There's more information available about this research that I've been doing on this website. There's my email address, and a big thank you again for joining me today to hear about this project. Thank you.